In this lecture, we are going to add a component called ToggleControl. I'm viewing an example from WordPress's Storybook. The ToggleControl component will render a slider for turning an option on or off. Next to the slider, there's a label. Overall, it's a simple design. Our goal is to ask the client if they're interested in displaying the category. This option will be presented with the ToggleControl component. If they enable this option, the page header will display the current category. Otherwise, clients will be able to write custom content. Let's get started. In your editor, open the block.json file. As usual, we should create an attribute for storing the option's value. Create an attribute called showCategory. The type property will be set to Boolean. A Boolean is a perfect data type for our attribute. I always recommend using Booleans for inputs like the ToggleControl component or a checkbox. Next, let's set the default value to false. By default, the page header block should not show the category. It should allow clients to write custom content. After adding our attribute, let's switch over to the index.js file. First, let's import the contents we will need for our block. From the block editor package, grab the inspector controls component. Next, we are going to import the panel body and toggle control components from the WordPress/components package. These components will be necessary for building our block settings. Let's move on to the edit function. From the attributes object, add the showCategory attribute to the destructure list. We are going to need this attribute for the ToggleControl component. Next, let's add the inspector controls component above the template for the block. This component will help us insert content into the sidebar. Before rendering the control, insert the panel body component for isolating our block settings from other panels. Next, we should add the title property for the panel's title. Let's set the title to the double underscore function with the following text: General. The typical setup for the sidebar is ready. Let's get into using the ToggleControl component by inserting it into the panel body component. The ToggleControl component will add the UI element we saw at the beginning of the lecture. This UI element can be customized with a few set of properties. For starters, let's add a label with a property called label. As we do with all text, we are going to call the double underscore function with the following value: showCategory. The label property will render the text next to the slider. After adding the label, we should allow the control to manipulate the showCategory attribute. At this point, you may have noticed a pattern with components defined by WordPress. Most components have a property for setting the initial value of a control. In addition, there is an event for updating the attribute after the control's value has changed. This is a very common pattern you'll come across for most components. The ToggleControl component is no different. On this component, we can set the checked property to the showCategory attribute. This property will set the current value of the control. It's expecting the value to be a Boolean. Luckily, our attribute's data type is also a Boolean. Moving on, let's add an event called onChange. This event gets fired on updates. We can execute a function on this event. Let's pass in an arrow function that accepts the new value. Next, we can update the showCategory attribute with the new value. As we learned before, we can shorten this syntax by renaming the argument to showCategory. Afterward, the property can be inserted without a value. This is the equivalent of what we had before. I just wanted to show you the shorthand syntax again. After making those changes, our component is ready. It's that simple. In the browser, let's refresh the experimental page. Next, let's add the page header block. On the sidebar, we are going to find a panel called General. The ToggleControl Component will render the UI we saw on WordPress's Storybook. We can interact with this component to enable or disable the category option. Let's verify the attribute gets updated. I'm going to enable this option. Next, from the block list, copy the page header block to your clipboard. If you were to view the block's HTML comment, you should see something like this. Originally, the default value of the show category attribute was false. However, by enabling the slider, the attribute's value has been set to true. This means our control is working as intended. That's awesome. We can start applying this attribute to our block. In the next lecture, let's start using our attribute to toggle the content.